President Trump ratcheting up the tariff war with a measure that could be another big blow to Canada. Donald Trump announced a 50% tariff on copper.
Of course, our embassy in Washington is following very closely, as well as the entire team back in Ottawa.
On July 9th, President Donald Trump announced a new 50% tariff on all copper imports into the United States. The policy takes effect August 1st and has already sent shockwaves through global supply chains. But while much of the world is reacting with uncertainty, one neighbor isn't panicking. Canada isn't shouting, it's watching. Because for Ottawa, this isn't just another tariff. It's a test of strategy and of how far Trump is willing to go before Canada decides to push back. In 2023, Canada exported 9.3 billion Canadian dollars worth of copper and copper-based products, according to Statistics Canada. Over half, about 4.8 billion, went to the United States. That trade now sits on the edge of a cliff. Canadian producers fear that if no exemption is reached, their products will become instantly uncompetitive compared to US-based suppliers. Some Canadian exporters, especially those who shifted into copper during earlier rounds of US metal tariffs, now find themselves back under threat. For businesses that rely on the US for a fifth of their sales, the prospect of a 50% tariff could mean lost contracts, layoffs, or even full market exit. This isn't an abstract policy debate. It's the real cost of losing access to a partner that, for decades, served as Canada's largest customer for critical minerals.
If you were to ask Donald Trump that question, I guess he would say he's answered it today in his Truth Social post that he wants to rebuild the American copper industry.
Trump's reasoning is clear: rebuild America's industrial base. In a social post, he framed copper as vital to the future, powering everything from electric vehicles to military systems and data centers. But unlike aluminum or steel, the US still relies heavily on foreign copper. It takes years to build new smelters or expand mining operations. In the short term, manufacturers will face higher prices, and consumers may feel the effects in products that touch nearly every part of modern life. To Canada, this doesn't look like industrial policy. It looks like leverage, a pressure tactic to bring negotiating partners to the table. And the deadline, August 1st, is now a countdown clock for everyone involved.
Being said, every single journalist in the country wants to have more information about the negotiations. The same. We will let the Prime Minister do the negotiation, supported, of course, by our negotiator-in-chief back in Washington, Kirsten Holman, and we will not negotiate in public.
Yet Canada isn't moving publicly. Not yet. Industry Minister Melanie Joly says there is still no executive order, but confirms that Ottawa and the Canadian Embassy in Washington are following very closely. Prime Minister Mark Carney has not responded publicly, a pattern that reflects his cautious, behind-the-scenes style. Canada's lead negotiator, Ambassador Kirsten Hillman, is working in Washington to secure an outcome before the window closes. The government's focus, Joly says, is on protecting workers and supporting companies at the front line of this trade war, from aluminum and steel now to copper. Canada's goal is simple: secure a carve-out, a specific exemption for copper under a broader bilateral agreement. It's not unprecedented. Canada has achieved similar deals in the past. But this time, the pressure is higher. The self-imposed deadline is July 21st. That gives Carney's team less than 2 weeks to finalize a trade and security agreement with the US before the tariffs hit. Donald Trump's strategy is loud. The announcements come via social media, the targets are clear, and the deadlines are firm. Canada's strategy is quieter, but not weaker. Every move is measured. Every response is calculated. As August 1st approaches, the world will watch whether Canada bends or negotiates its way out. In this trade war, timing is power. And while Trump holds the microphone, Carney is holding the clock.
Sign even ones that they've kind of announced, like the US and the UK and Vietnam and even China. They've made progress, but they still haven't actually signed off on everything. We're still being targeted for tariffs and for adjustment in the terms of trade. So there's still a higher level of uncertainty in Canada right now that could impact the job market.
Canada didn't receive a tariff letter. While President Trump warned over a dozen nations of new import penalties starting August 1st, Canada wasn't among them. But that's not a sign of favor. It's because talks are still underway. With a July 21st deadline looming, Canada is quietly negotiating behind closed doors. But even without a fresh threat, the impact of Trump's economic agenda and his Big Beautiful Bill is already being felt. Trump's Big Beautiful Bill was billed as a win for American taxpayers. Tax cuts extended, military spending increased, social programs trimmed. But the math tells a different story. According to nonpartisan budget analysts, the bill is expected to widen the U.S. deficit by more than $3.4 trillion over the next 10 years. Tariffs can't fill that hole, but they do help craft a political message. One where the U.S. isn't just spending recklessly, but collecting from others. And that's where countries like Canada find themselves back in the frame. Canada may have avoided a new tariff letter this month, but it's still operating under 25% U.S. tariffs on general goods and a punishing 50% rate on steel and aluminum, all part of Trump's broader strategy to extract better trade terms. The short-term impact is clear. According to Statistics Canada, exports to the U.S. fell to their lowest levels since 2020 and May 2025. Some sectors, like steel, have seen double-digit declines. Canadian firms are quietly shifting supply chains elsewhere. Being left off the latest tariff list might feel like relief, but it's not immunity. Canada is still in the storm, just not the eye of it. Late last month, the Canadian government repealed its digital services tax, a policy aimed at taxing large U.S. tech firms like Amazon and Google. The move wasn't because Ottawa changed its mind. It was a concession, a calculated step to restart trade talks with Washington before the July 21st deadline. In other words, Canada blinked. Quietly, and there's more at stake than taxes. Canada is deeply embedded in U.S.-centric supply chains. Sectors like auto, aerospace, and natural resources depend on cross-border logistics. When Trump labels tariffs as emergency tools, markets shudder, and Canadian companies feel the aftershocks. On the surface, the Canadian stock market has held up well, thanks to multinational firms like Shopify and Barrick Gold. But that masks what's happening underneath. In June, SIA Wealth Management warned of job losses in tariff-exposed industries, a trend confirmed by rising unemployment in trade-related sectors across Ontario and Alberta. Facing all this, Prime Minister Mark Carney is walking a tightrope. On one hand, he's trying to protect Canadian jobs, exports, and consumer prices. On the other, he's dealing with a U.S. administration that ties economic access to loyalty and doesn't hesitate to punish hesitation. Carney's strategy so far has been one of restraint. No loud protests, no retaliation, just careful moves, like repealing the digital tax, aimed at keeping talks alive without sacrificing long-term sovereignty. It's not weakness, it's patience. And it's buying time ahead of the July 21st deadline, the point when Canada must decide whether to accept Trump's terms or risk further escalation. In today's trade landscape, allies don't get a free pass. They get tested. Canada may not be targeted today. But with Trump turning tariffs into a permanent tool of foreign policy, and with America's fiscal hole still deepening, no country is truly safe. And if pressure builds again, Canada will face the same question every U.S. partner is asking: negotiate, retaliate, or quietly endure. For now, Ottawa is choosing silence. But silence isn't surrender, it's strategy.
The only thing that can't be created here is an end to the tariffs.
It's affected me pretty severely. The main thing being the complete drop-off of our American sales momentum.
It's our plan to say, let's produce as much as we can in Canada.
In 2025, Donald Trump launched a new round of tariffs. Cars not made in the U.S., 25%, aluminum, steel, lumber, more tariffs. His message was simple: bring factories home, punish foreign suppliers, rebuild American industry. But just months into this effort, the consequences are taking shape, and they're not what the White House promised. Canadian firms are pulling back, U.S. businesses are scrambling, and everyday Americans are paying more for cars, groceries, even homes.
Ron Marcolin says many businesses in the region have focused on growing trade with Europe and India. A recent survey conducted by the group shows the tariffs continue to negatively impact businesses across Canada.
Across Canada, the message was clear. The U.S. was no longer a stable trade partner. In New Brunswick, glassmaker Curtis Dion saw his U.S. sales vanish. In 2024, buyers from the U.S. made up 10% of his business. In 2025, that number dropped to 0. Schneider Electric, a global energy firm, made its own move. It expanded production at its plant in Brossard, Quebec, boosting capacity by 30% and hiring 17 new workers. The goal wasn't growth for its own sake. It was a pivot away from dependency. The company said it planned to produce as much as we can in Canada, regardless of what happened across the border. And the data supported this shift. According to Statistics Canada, in May 2025, exports to the U.S. declined, while exports to other countries surged nearly 6%, a record. That shift wasn't symbolic. It was structural. Canada also holds strategic leverage. Ontario briefly floated a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to the U.S. Chlorine, aluminum, and softwood lumber, key ingredients for U.S. infrastructure and consumer goods, largely come from Canadian sources. And if tariffs push them out, the alternatives will be slower, pricier, and less secure.
One thing's for sure, cars are about to get more expensive in the U.S.
Aluminum's a whole different world. There's a reason why it was outsourced to begin with.
We have to ask ourselves, what are the reasons why we don't produce enough in this country?
Inside the U.S., many companies are caught off guard. Big brands like Walmart stocked up early. Their imports from China jumped 33% in 2024. But small firms didn't have that luxury. Deer Stags, a footwear company, imports 98% of its shoes from China. With no room to stockpile, they now face tariffs over 16%, pulled directly from their bank account by U.S. Customs. At ITS Logistics in Fort Worth, Texas, companies rushed to store goods before tariffs kicked in. But that came at a cost. Warehousing, shipping, compliance. It all adds up, and all of it gets passed to the customer. For businesses without deep pockets, this isn't protection, it's punishment. That brings us to the people who have no choice but to absorb it all: American consumers. In March 2025, the aluminum tariff was raised to 25%. By May, the U.S. Midwest aluminum premium had jumped more than 60%, according to S&P Global. Coca-Cola warned it may shift more packaging to plastic to avoid the impact. In the auto sector, the fallout was sharper. The average transaction price for new cars in the U.S. neared $50,000 in February 2025. With tariffs, analysts from Cox Automotive projected price hikes between 15% and 20% for cars built outside the U.S. or made with foreign parts. That's roughly $6,000 added per vehicle. The construction industry was hit too. CoreLogic estimated that tariffs on steel, aluminum, and Canadian lumber could raise the price of a newly built home by $22,000 over the next 12 months. That's on top of a market where over 100 million American households already can't afford the median home price. Trump promised a revival: factories, jobs, American steel. But reality moves slower. New aluminum smelters take up to 10 years. Sawmills can't ramp up overnight. Labor shortages and environmental limits stand in the way. Meanwhile, Canada is already moving forward, cutting exposure to U.S. risk and finding new markets. And back in the U.S., it's not China or Mexico footing the bill. It's the small manufacturers, the independent builders, the families trying to buy their first home. Trump called it a trade strategy, but to many Americans, it's starting to look like a bill they can't afford.